Hello and welcome back to Parallax Scrolling for web design. In our last video, we talked about what we're going to be doing with this particular project, and we've taken a look at our HTML file here. And now, before we get started styling this, I want to duplicate this folder. So you're going to be starting off with this lesson 3 folder that we've already talked about, this lesson 3 start folder. So go ahead and open up those files, and those are the files you're going to be following along with. And then when everything's done, I'm going to save all of this in a separate folder. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. I'm going to right click on that and duplicate it here. And I'm going to change the name of this new folder to lesson 3 end. And I'm going to work with these files so that I don't accidentally save over the start files. But again, if you're following along, you want to go ahead and start with these start files. And then at the end of this video, when everything is saved, this end folder is going to be what we're working with. So we're going to jump into our browser here, and I want to change the URL here from lesson 3 start to lesson 3 end, and hopefully nothing changes. Everything still looks like it did before. Also, we don't need these extra tabs here, so let's just clear those out to clean up our browser a little bit. And let's get started with our styling. So I'm going to pull TextMate onto the screen here, and again, we've seen the HTML file, and I'll just repeat, as we mentioned in the last video, that the background for this file is going to be placed in a separate empty div, and then we'll place our content div on top of that. So in our CSS folder, we've got our normalize.css, which we're not going to be touching at all. I don't want to mess with that. So let's create a new file inside our CSS folder, and I'm going to call this main.css. So we'll create that, and now we have an empty CSS file to work with. So let's start with the grid. Let's go ahead and put a background on it and give it a width and height. So we're going to point to the pound grid selector, which is it's going to be that div with the ID of grid. And let's give it a background. And I always like to provide a fallback background color in case for some reason the images aren't working. So we'll give it a fallback color of white, pound FFF, space, and then we'll give it a URL. We'll point to the image inside the image folder. And remember, this CSS file is inside a CSS folder, so we need to point outside of that folder before we can point into the images folder. So we're going to type ... to move up one directory, / img for the images directory, / and then the name of the image, which is grid.gif. And then I want that to be positioned in the top left portion of the screen. So we're going to type top left, and then we'll set the width and height. Our width is going to be, we want it to take up the entire width of the browser. So we'll set that to 100%. And for our height, for now, I'm going to set it to a value of 2000 pixels. And it just occurred to me that I'm doing all of this inside the lesson 3 start folder, which defeats the purpose of what I was doing in the first place. So I'm going to grab that code, cut it, close the main.css, and I'm not going to save it. Instead, I'm going to remove that file because I don't want to mess with this start folder, and we'll delete references to it. There we go. And instead of the lesson 3 start file, I want to start with the lesson 3 end folder. And that should serve us well there. Okay, so now let's go into the HTML file, and then inside the CSS folder, we'll create a new file called main. Oops, let's highlight all of that, main.css, and then we'll paste that code that we just copied. Okay, so there we go. We've got our grid selector in which we're putting our background image. We've given it a width of 100% and a height of 2000 pixels. So let's go ahead and save that and jump into our browser and refresh. And we're not seeing anything yet because we haven't pointed to that CSS file. Let's go back into our index.html file, scroll up to the top, and we need to, in our head, put another link to a style sheet. So link rel equals style sheet, href equals css/main.css. There we go. So now let's refresh it. And there we go. So now we see the background, but since we gave that div with an ID of grid a height of 2000 pixels, we're going to see all 2000 pixels of that height before we even get to our content. Obviously not what we're going for, but it's a good starting place. So another thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and fix that background in place so that it's not moving. So I'm going to jump back into TextMate here, and in our CSS file, we're going to set the position of this grid div. We're going to set it to fixed so that it stays still, it doesn't move, and we're going to set its top position to 0. Save that, go back to our page and refresh. Everything looks the same, except now you'll notice that we can't scroll, but at the same time we're having a hard time seeing our content. We can't see it. Well, when we set our position to fixed, that basically got out of the way so that our content could move back up to the top of the screen. The problem is this grid div is showing up on top of the content div, so we can easily fix that by changing the Z index of both. So let's jump back into our file, and here we're going to set the Z index of our grid to 1, and then we'll create a rule for our content div, and we'll give it a Z index of 2. So we'll save that, jump back into our file and refresh. And we're still not seeing that because we need to give it a position here of relative. Save that and refresh, and there we go. So now we see our text on top of our background, so that's a good start. Now nothing is scrolling yet because our content doesn't take up enough height to scroll, but if we were to make our browser a lot smaller, we could then scroll up and down and see our text scrolling while our background stays still. And that's what we're going for. And later on, when we start coding this in jQuery, we're going to adjust the top position of that background div. Remember, if we go back into our code, we set the top position, or the top property here of our grid div, we've set that to 0. And as we scroll, we're going to change that value here using jQuery. And by changing that value, we'll change the vertical position of that background grid. So now let's style our content just a little bit more for now. We'll set our color, the color of our text that is, equal to #888, which will be kind of a medium gray color. We've set our position to relative. Let's go ahead and center align the text here. So we'll set text align to center. And then I want to set the width to 960 pixels. And then I want the entire div to be centered on the stage. So we're going to set our margins to 0 auto, and that will center the entire 960 pixel width div within the browser. So let's save that and refresh our page. And there we go. So we've given it a specific width of 960 pixels, and using that margin of 0 auto, we've centered that div within the stage. We've also centered the text because I want the text at the top to be centered, but then inside each of these articles, we want to left align the text. So let's jump back into our CSS, and let's point to the content div space, and then we'll point to any articles within that content div. And we'll set the text align to not center, I'm sorry, left. Save that and then refresh our page, and there we go. Everything is still centered, but the text within each article is now set to the left. Now we could have done this a different way. We could have just set the text align for this header to center, but I did it this way, and that works for me, so there we go. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make each of these articles a little bit larger, and I want to put a background on each one of them to make them stand out a little bit. So let's go back into our code, and here we have the content space article rule. We've set the text align to left, but we want to do a few more things here. I want to put a background on it, so we'll set our background -color to £F4F4F4. So it's going to be a light gray, almost white background there. And then I'm also going to give it a border, which is going to be a little bit darker than the background color. It's going to be a 1 pixel border, so 1 pixels, space solid, space pound, and then we're going to use a hex value of DDD for that. We'll set our height for each of these articles to 200 pixels. And then I also want to put 20 pixels of padding inside those articles, inside each one of those articles. And then one more thing I want to do here is I want to make it slightly transparent, not very, but we'll just change the opacity here to maybe 0.8. So it'll be 80% opaque or 20% transparent, however you prefer to look at it. We'll save that, jump back into our browser and refresh, and there we go. And we can see we have a slightly transparent background. We can still see the background behind it, but that looks pretty good. The next thing I want to do is just to apply a little bit of spacing between each one. So let's go back into our file and change our margins, or add some margins here. We'll set our margin to, let's set our top bottom margin to 50 pixels, and then our left right margin to 0. And that should do the trick for us. So let's save that, refresh our page, and there we go. Now we have a little bit more spacing in between each of our articles, and you can see as we scroll up and down that our background stays fixed in place. So in the next video, we're going to jump into jQuery and talk about how we can make this background scroll and scroll at a different rate than our foreground. So with everything saved in the Lesson 3 End folder, we'll start with these files in the next video. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you then.